There will be times when we want to have the ability to go directly to the vCenter appliance for management of that appliance. Not the vCenter, but the appliance itself, for things like backing it up, changing the configuration of the IP address, and so forth. And to make that easy to do, VMware has given us a direct path using a browser to connect to a special user interface for management of the appliance itself. And that's what we get to talk about and then demonstrate in this nugget. Someone once told me that there's only two types of users or individuals when it comes to data loss. Those people who've had it and those people who will have it. And because the vCenter is so critical to managing vSphere, if we lost that virtual machine or the database became corrupt, that would significantly hamper our ability to do central management on the ESXi hosts. So we're going to want to periodically do things like backups of that vCenter server appliance and also updates. We might need to power it off or reboot it. So VMware has provided a separate management user interface that we can use to connect to the vCenter server appliance. And here's the URL. It's https:// the name or IP address that resolves to the vCenter server appliance, and we're going to go to a non-standard port. So HTTPS uses TCP port 443 by default. We are going to go to TCP port 5480. And that takes us to the management user interface for the vCenter appliance. And when we use this URL and we connect to the management user interface, that's when we log on as root to the vCenter appliance and supply the root password for the appliance that we configured when we deployed it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and connect to that URL from our management workstation so you can get a feel for what that management user interface looks like and what's available there. And then once you and I have gone through that in the nugget, I'd love for you to go ahead and do it hands-on in the hands-on lab. And if you want to, you can go ahead and launch the hands-on lab right now. And that'll give a 5 to 10 minute head start for the lab to fully boot up and the vCenter server appliance to initialize so that when you're ready to do the hands-on, you won't have to wait for that VM to be completely ready. So here we are on DCNUG. Let's go ahead and launch Chrome from the icon in the taskbar. And from here, let's go ahead and connect to https:// and we'll specify vCSA. And actually, that will resolve to the .111 address, so we don't have to put in .nuggetlab.com. And then we can put the colon and the port of 5480. So we'll put in :5480 and then press enter to connect. Now Chrome is warning us that it doesn't trust the self-signed certificate that's coming from this vCenter appliance. So we'll click on Advanced and then scroll down just a little bit, and then we'll click on this link at the very bottom that says Proceed to vCSA. So we'll click on that bottom link, and it's asking us to authenticate. So we're going to authenticate as root. We'll hit Tab and then supply our lab password. And with those supplied, we'll click Login. So in the navigator pane on the left, we have the summary at the top. Below that, we have Access. And with Access selected, we can go over here on the right and click Edit, and we can enable SSH login and a bash shell if we wanted to for connecting to and working with this vCenter appliance. Below Access, we have Networking. By default, we're looking at the Monitor tab. If we wanted to manage the networking, we can click on the Manage tab. And then we have the Edit button over on the far right that would allow us to modify the configuration. Going down the list on the navigator pane, we have Time. So here we have the NTP server information that we configured when we deployed this virtual machine. If we wanted to change it, of course, we go ahead and click on Edit and change those parameters. Below Time on the navigator pane, we have Update. And here, if we click on Settings, we can specify whether to check for updates automatically, and it has the URL for that right here. Or we can select use a specified repository. Then we can click on OK if we made changes, or click on Cancel if we don't want to make any changes there. Continuing down in the navigation panel, we have Administration. So if we wanted to change the root password, this is where we would do it. And I'm also going to click on No regarding root password expires. That way, in 6 months, when people are still working on these labs, they won't get nag messages regarding a root password having expired. Then below that, we have syslog configuration. So if we click on Edit, we can specify the destination for a syslog server for centralized collection and management of our logs. And then below that, we have CPU and memory. And then below that, we have an option for database, which we can use to look at the capacity of what we're currently using and how we're trending, just to make sure we're not going to run out of space. So if we go back up on the navigator panel and click on Summary, we also have some pretty useful options over here, including a shutdown of the vCenter server appliance. Now, we could do a shutdown of the virtual machine that's running the vCenter appliance through the vSphere web client. But if we just need to do a shutdown or a reboot, This is yet another way through the management interface that allows us to do those tasks right here. We also have an option for backing up, which, by the way, is not a bad idea. So if we clicked on backup, we have several options regarding the protocol. So if we had an FTP server or an HTTP or HTTPS server that was all set up to allow us to transfer files to it for a backup, we would select that protocol, put in the address and the path, put in the username and password regarding the authentication, and if we wanted to, we could also encrypt the backup data. So the key is, if we do encrypt the backup, if we ever wanted to restore from this backup, we'd have to remember that password. So if you don't want to encrypt the backup, you remove the check from that checkbox. And then once you click on next, it gives you some options regarding the level of detail that you want to include in the backup. It also gives you the approximate size of those backups. So one of the questions might come up is, what if we do a backup and then we need to restore? How do we go about that? And here's the great news. To do a restore from an existing backup, what we would do is we'd go back to our management computer. Because we're so close, we're at DCNUG. If we open up File Explorer by using this icon here in the taskbar, and let me bring that full screen. And if we click on the left-hand side on this PC, and then go to our DVD drive, where I have the installer for the vCenter server appliance, and we open that by double-clicking on it, the way we would do a restore from an existing backup is very similar on how we would deploy a whole new vCenter appliance. We simply go to the installer folder, which is vCSA UI installer, by double-clicking on it, going into Win32, just like we did when we deployed it originally. And the path is right up here regarding where we are at this moment. And then we just go ahead and launch the installer. So we'll go ahead and double-click on the installer to launch it. And then instead of choosing install, the top option, which we did originally when we deployed the vCenter appliance, we're going to go down here to the restore option at the bottom. So we'll click on restore. It's going to walk us through stage 1 and stage 2, but when we click on next, and we accept the terms of the end user license agreement by putting a check in that box and clicking next, now it's asking us, okay, where's the backup? So we go ahead and specify the protocol we're using to reach the backup, the path, the username, the password, and if we encrypted the backup, we'd also specify the encryption password right here, which is going to be required if we want to restore from that backup. And then it walks through the process of the installation and the restoration of a vCenter appliance from our backup. And in a production environment, one of the only ways to really verify that a backup works is to fully test it, and not just hope for the best until there's a disaster. So I'll go ahead and click on cancel here regarding the restore, and click on yes to close it. Then I'll close File Explorer. And I just thought of one other thing that I'd like to do. You know, in the appliance management user interface, we said that the root password never expires, which is great for the lab environment. However, we also have an administrator account inside of vCenter that does have an expiration, and I'd also like to fix that right now so it doesn't expire either. We'll go ahead and launch the vSphere web client. We'll use this shortcut right here on the desktop to do that. We'll go ahead and authenticate as administrator at vsphere.local. We'll supply our lab password, and then we'll click Login. We'll give that a moment to initialize. And this is taking us back to the general location where we were when we left it in a previous nugget. So regarding setting the rules for password changes, we're going to go ahead and hover over this home icon near the top. And then from the drop down, we're going to click on Administration. So we'll click on Administration. And then over here on the left under the navigator pane, we'll go under Single Sign-On and we'll click on Configuration regarding Single Sign-On. Then we have the Policies tab, which we're brought to, and then below that we have the password policy selected, and then over on the right we have an Edit button where we can change the password policy. So we'll click on Edit, and then regarding the maximum lifetime, instead of 90 days for the lab environment, I'm going to say 0, which means to vCenter, passwords never expire. This is also where we would set our complexity rules regarding passwords. So the minimum and maximum lengths, the character requirements regarding special characters, alphanumerics, upper and lower case, identical adjacent characters, and we can specify a restriction regarding reuse. So with a number of 5 passwords there for the restrict reuse, a user could not go back to one of their previous 5 passwords when they change their password. So our goal here was to set the maximum lifetime to 0, which we have, and we'll click on OK. And then if we want to go back to the main page, we could do it a couple ways. We could go to Recent Objects down here and click on it. and then click on a recent object, and that would take us back to that location. Or we could go ahead and hover over the home icon and then select something from that drop-down list. So if we click on home, that's going to take us to the home page for the vSphere web client. And we can also minimize any panes that we don't want to see that have the push pin icon simply by clicking on the push pin. And if we want to change the interface back to the way it was originally before we started making changes, we can also go up to administrator at vSphere.local, click on the down arrow, and then from the drop down we can click on layout settings. And if we click on reset to factory layout, and let's go ahead and do that, that'll put everything back to the way it was originally when we first logged on to the vCenter server. So then if we wanted to minimize these, we could use the push pins once again and minimize the ones we don't want to see, which again will give us the most real estate possible when working with the vSphere web client. So now, if we need to connect to the appliance management user interface, we know that we can connect to its IP address or a name that resolves to its IP address and connect on TCP port 5480. We'll log on as root, we'll supply the password, and that allows direct access to that management user interface on the appliance. And now you have the opportunity to do the labs and get some hands-on practice working with the management user interface. So enjoy the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.